This is Mr. Martin. This is video notes for Geometry Honors, section 2.5. We're going to be talking about the addition and subtraction properties. So you're going to want to add these to your theorem sheet. Hopefully you're making your theorem sheet and you've got that updated, because it's probably getting a little bit long, and if you haven't started it yet, it's going to take you a bit of time to get it going. Anyway, addition and subtraction, we're going to be talking about adding segments or subtracting segments, or adding or subtracting angles. And I think one of the most important ideas for you to get from these notes today is that in order to use these properties, you must use the picture with it. Okay, so you're going to have your given information, and you have to use the picture with the given information to make your conclusions and determine whether it's going to be addition or subtraction. Alright, and I would also highly recommend the use of tick marks on your pictures, and as we go through that I'll show you. So for addition, really we've got four things over here. I just kind of combine them, so it's the segment addition properties and the angle addition properties. So if you're working with angles, you just substitute in the word angle or angles for the word segment or segments. And you see here I have a single segment bolded, underlined, and capitalized, and over here I have congruent segments bold and capitalized and underlined. So make sure you understand the difference, and again the pictures are going to be different for those as well. So if a single segment or angle is added to congruent segments or angles, then the sums are congruent. So we're going to take one single angle and we're going to add it to two other segments or angles. And again, once you start using the pictures, hopefully this will start to make more sense. Make sure you get some help if you need it. And then the next one is if congruent segments or angles are added to congruent segments or angles, then the sums are congruent. And then we've got the same thing for subtraction. We can subtract a single segment or angle from congruent segments or angles, or we can subtract congruent segments or angles from congruent segments or angles. Again, make sure you're using the right terminology. We're talking about sums for the first set of properties. We're talking about differences for the second set of properties. And again, here's our notes. It is going to be very, very important to use the picture. Okay, you will need to use a diagram to determine whether addition or subtraction is appropriate. So we've got 8 examples. And if you noticed up here, we had 8 properties. If you count segments and angles, we've got 8 properties, and we need to figure out which property is going to go where. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video and see if you can fill these in, feel free. Otherwise, feel free to work along with me. Alright, so for number 1, we've got that segment DH is congruent to segment BI, so I'm going to put some tick marks here, DH and BI. And what I want to prove is that DI, I'm going to use a question mark tick mark, is congruent to BH. Alright, so if you notice I have these two smaller segments on the outside. If I add HI to DH, I'm going to get DI. And if I add HI to BI, I'm going to get BH. And these two longer segments are the ones that I want to prove are congruent. So if I add this single segment to the congruent segments on the outsides, then the sums will be congruent. So if, and you don't have to write a single, I just wanted to stress that, the importance of that in the property. So you can write if a segment is added to congruent segments, then the sums are congruent. Okay? Let's take a look at number 2. I've got Kn is congruent to LO, and I've got that Mn So this little segment here is congruent to MO, and I want to prove that this big segment here is congruent to this big segment here. So if I take one of the segments with the 2 tick marks and one of the segments with the little circle tick mark and add those together, I'm going to have a 2 tick mark and a circle segment on the left and a 2 tick mark and a circle tick mark on the right. So if I add the congruent segments, the little congruent segments on the inside to the big congruent segments on the outside, then the sums are going to have to be congruent. So if congruent segments are added to congruent segments, then the sums are congruent. Make sure you write the sums are congruent, or when we get to differences, you write the differences are congruent. Don't just say then they are congruent, because that's not specific enough. Alright, again, anytime you start to feel like you're getting the hang of it and you want to try these on your own, feel free to stop the video and work those out on your own. Alright, so for number 3 I have angle UPW. So this is UPW is congruent to QPV. That's this one over here. And I want to prove that UPV is congruent to QPW. Right? So I can see that I have this angle in the middle that I'm going to add to the angle on the bottom and add to the angle on the top to get the larger angles. So this would be if an angle is added to congruent angles, then the sums are congruent. Moving on to the next one, I've got CBF congruent to, I think that's an A over there, ABE, and I've got FBD congruent to EBD, and I want to prove that the larger angles CBD and ABE are congruent. So again, if I take the little congruent angles on the inside and add them to the bigger congruent angles on the outside, then the big angle on the left will have a 1 tick mark and a 2 tick mark, and the big angle on the right will have a 1 tick mark and a 2 tick mark. So if congruent angles are added to congruent angles, then the sums are congruent. So that takes care of our 4 addition. I'm going to erase my tick marks up here because we're going to use these pictures again. So again, these are just the most basic examples to kind of show you how the problems work. Alright, so moving on to number 5, I've got that segment DI, so that's this one, is congruent to segment BH, and I want to prove that the smaller segments are congruent. So I can see if I take out this segment in the middle from the 2 bigger segments, I'll end up with what I want to prove. So if A segment is subtracted from congruent segments, then the differences are congruent. Alright, moving on to the next one. I've got KN and LO. So I've got this segment is congruent to this segment, and I've got KM, so this large segment, congruent to this large segment, and I want to prove that MN and OM are congruent, so the little ones. So if I subtract out these smaller segments from the bigger segments, then I'll get the little segments on the inside. So we're subtracting congruent segments from congruent segments. If congruent segments are subtracted from congruent segments, then the differences are congruent. Okay, so if you look at the difference in 1 and 5 and 2 and 6, in 1 and 5 we have really one pair of congruent angles that overlap. And in 2 and 6 we have two pair of congruent segments that we're either adding or subtracting. And it works the same way with angles. If you've got some angles that overlap, you're probably going to subtract a single angle. And if you've got two sets of angles, you're probably going to add or subtract congruent angles to congruent angles or from congruent angles. Alright, so for number 7 I have UPV, so that's this angle, is congruent to QPW over here, and I want to prove that these angles on the outside are congruent. So I'm going to subtract out this angle in the middle. So if an angle is subtracted from congruent angles, then the differences are congruent. Alright, and then the last one, the only one we have left, I've got that CBD, so I've got that this angle over here is congruent to ABD, this angle over here, and I've got these smaller angles on the inside are congruent, angle FBD and EBD, and I want to prove that the angles on the outside are congruent. Okay, so if I subtract the smaller angles on the inside from the bigger angles, I'll be left with the ones on the outside, so we're going to subtract congruent angles from congruent angles. If congruent angles are subtracted from congruent angles, then the differences are congruent. Alright, so that's all we have for this. Once you start working on the problem set, if you're having trouble with the proofs, make sure that you get some help from me. You know, once you get the hang of using the theorems and the definitions and the properties and the postulates, it's going to get a lot easier. If you're struggling right now, this is really the time to get help. You know, 5 or 10 minutes is usually all it takes. And we'll see you in class.